All right, I'm Colleen with the Tampa-Hillsborough County Library System, and welcome to Written By with author Gale Massey. We're excited to have Gale here tonight as part of our Tales and Tales summer reading program. Gale Massey's debut novel, The Girl from Blind River, received a 2018 Florida Book Award and was a finalist for the Clara Johnson Award. Her work has appeared in Lambda Literary, Cut Bank, Crime Reads, Sable, the Tampa Bay Times, Saw Palm, and the anthology Tampa Bay Noir, which you can actually check out from our library system. Gale was a Tennessee Williams Scholar at the Sewanee Writers Conference, a fellow at the Writers in Paradise, and has served as a panel judge for the Lambda Literary Awards. She has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize in both fiction and nonfiction. So we're going to do a quick book shout out. Gale is going to be talking to us about her newest collection, Rising and Other Stories. It's a short story collection. We're really excited for that. So we're going to shout out her first novel, which is called The Girl from Blind River. It's a small town thriller mystery that explores one woman's ties to family and what that means for her future and her role in the town. You can find it in our catalog as an audiobook on Hoopla, ebook on Libby, or you can place a hold on one of the many physical copies in our collection. So you should grab a copy and log your summer reading hours on Beanstack at hcplc.beanstack.org. All right, so we're ready to get things started. I'm going to hand things over to Gale, and she's going to start her presentation. Thanks, Gale.
Thank you. Thank you, Colleen, for hosting this evening, and thanks to the library system for having me. I'm going to read first from The Girl from Blind River. I'm going to read 3 small sections tonight, 2 short stories from Rising and Other Stories, and just the first 2 pages of The Girl from Blind River. So here we go. Jamie shielded her eyes from a gust of wind blowing down the street and crossed the dirt yard in front of her uncle's trailer. A beagle, huddled against the night air in the back of a pickup truck, lifted its head and whined, but Jamie had nothing to feed it. Halfway at the porch steps, she heard the men inside, grabbed the mail that no one had bothered to collect for the last few days, and opened the door. The air inside was thick with smoke and the smell of beer and whiskey. The wind from outside lifted her uncle's ball cap, but he caught it and pulled it tight. He sat at the head of the kitchen table with 5 of his buddies, most of them still wearing blue work shirts from their shifts at the fertilizer plant south of town. Every Friday night, these men clocked out at 5 o'clock sharp and drove to her Uncle Loyal's place for a night of booze and poker. Years ago, she'd vowed never to become some good old boy's wife, sitting around the duplex waiting for her life to turn out like her own mother's had. Not when she was so good at poker, and not when other 19-year-olds were already playing the professional circuit. She had almost enough money to go pro, and pretty soon her little brother would be big enough to handle himself alone with their uncle. Loyal tossed an empty pizza box on the floor and peeked at his hole cards. A bottle of Jack Daniels parked near his elbow. His best buddy, the county judge, sat to his left, looking somewhat out of place in this group with his neatly trimmed gray hair and red sweater. But his presence explained the Cadillac parked alongside the pickups outside. The sight of her made him bristle. The sight of him made her bristle. Keating was the one who decided that Jamie and Toby would live with their uncle while their mother spent those 8 years in prison. But he rarely came to this side of town. Toby belched and wiped his mouth, avoiding the welt that ran the length of his cheekbone. His eyes stopped short of shut as he guzzled the dregs of a beer, crushed the can with his fist, and threw it toward the garbage. An empty shot glass was his marker, and he was down to his last chip, which he tossed into the pot and slurred, "I'm all in." A few beers and a little whiskey, and Toby was trashed enough to make a stupid bet. He was always the first player to go broke. Jamie searched the remaining pizza boxes until she found a piece of crust and chewed it while she watched the hand played out. Loyal called the boys' bet and huffed when Toby flipped over a 2-3. Whatever. Toby tripped when he stood, and the table rocked beneath his weight. Get him out of here, Jamie. Loyal pushed the boy away. It seemed Toby might push back or take a swing at his uncle, but his face went slack with the effort to stay upright, and he lurched toward the dark hallway. Judge Keating grabbed one of his arms and helped Jamie steer him down the hall to the back room. Toby passed out, face down on his cot, stinking of boyhood and pepperoni. I hear he can be a handful, Keating said. She expected him to drop Toby on the cot and leave, but he just stood there. The room was too tight to have a grown man standing in it. Jamie turned the lamp on. Clothes and school books were scattered on the floor, and with their two cots, there wasn't much room to navigate. Keating hovered near the doorway as though his being in this cramped room was natural. It wasn't, and she wished he'd leave. It was nobody's business how they lived. He looked around the room, and she could feel him judging every detail. The torn curtains, the grimy plywood floor, the old thin mattresses sunk low in the middle. You share this room? Yeah, she said. He knew how they lived, and she took it as a put down. She picked up a pair of jeans and folded them, giving him a look that meant it was time for him to go. But Keating lingered. He pointed at the recruitment poster hanging on the wall over Toby's bed, a uniformed soldier standing in front of a U.S. flag. I wanted to join the army when I was his age too, he said. Guns and tanks. Boys like to dream about powerful things like that. Jamie hated that poster, those eyes always staring at her, but Toby was crazy for anything army. He's going to military camp for the summer. That private school upstate? You got money for that? It was a stupid question. They never had that kind of money, and this man standing in her room with his brand new LL Bean sweater knew it. The back of her neck got hot. They let 2 kids in free last year. Hardship case, huh? I got an old friend there. I could give him a call. I doubt he'll get in without a decent reference. Keating stepped closer to her. She flinched before she realized he was just turning to leave. It's only a phone call. He hesitated at the dresser by the door and picked up a framed photograph of her and Toby with their mother from 10 years ago. Huh, he said. He looks just like his dad. You knew him? It always shocked her to realize there were people in town who had known her father when he'd been dead half her life. Of course, I knew both your parents in high school decades ago, and you look a lot like your mother. People who knew Phoebe Elders were always saying that, and it bothered Jamie. She saw herself as different and cringed at the notion that fate was handed down through family DNA. He touched a finger to the photo. The gesture was intimate and wrong for someone outside the family. Jamie grabbed at the frame, accidentally jabbing a fingernail into the back of his hand. He winced and dropped the frame. She stepped backwards. Sorry. She picked up the frame off the floor. There was a crack in the glass, but she could fix it with a little tape. So that was the first 2 pages of The Girl from Blind River. And now I'm going to read from Rising and Other Stories. Going to read a short story and then a piece of flash fiction. So the story I'm reading tonight is called Lucky Girl. On that last morning, I headed toward the desert. I headed toward the deserted, bright beach south of my shack. The sun was high overhead, sitting alone in a vacant sky. I hated to think of its isolation, how lonely it must be as it trudged overhead day after day, cursed with a timeless existence. A small breeze licked at the sweat beads popping up along my upper lip as I walked. The summer had been hot and relentless. Every night I dreamed of him, as though the dreams would keep him alive. But the dreams were always just more goodbyes, though they always felt as real as that last day. His hand letting go of mine, the skin on his fingers transparent and wasted, the bones so shrunken they could no longer hold his wedding band. But it wasn't really a dream. It was a memory I fell prey to whenever I slept, and every morning when the dream ended, I woke with grief sitting like a heat wave behind my eyes. The roped bridge connecting the mainland to the island swayed beneath my feet as I passed over the water. The horizon tilted one way and then another. I kept walking toward the stinging salt water that I would dive into, hoping to cleanse myself of the memory. Dreams restored the dead, but never fully. One minute they're dead, the next they're back, and sleep was nothing more than a groundhog's day for the living, a nightly boomerang. In the morning, when grief returned, and it always did, it slammed like the wind. At the end of the peninsula, I turned and followed the path to the beach, past hammocks of pine scrub set against the white beaches and restless water. A flock of gulls screeched their petty battles, picking over the beach's debris, fish bones, seaweed, stranded conchs, and skittish fiddler crabs, all in the stench of low tide. A few porpoises breached out in the deeper water, chasing a school of mackerel. I passed the Spanish ruins, so old they seemed like ancient boulders hidden in the landscape. The upper deck faced south toward sunrise and sunset and any passing boat. The top level had a view of the Gulf, the endless glare of sunlight bouncing off the surf. The pain it caused behind my eyes made me look away. One time, Dad took me down below the upper deck to the rooms that had been dug out of the ground, damp rooms filled with shadows, chains bolted to walls. Local folk claimed these rooms were dungeons to hold pirates or slaves. They said those rooms were haunted by ghosts. Dad laughed at those stories and said that was rubbish. Ghosts don't exist. These were just empty storerooms. When I got to the north end of the park, the beach was desolate. White sand stretched out for miles with no one else in sight. Pelicans flew in formation overhead, then dropped low to let their wings skim the water. A school of fish and a stingray swam past. The air was still and the water flat and calm, a place so barren it might have been the surface of the moon. As I waded out to a sandbar 100 yards offshore, the water got deep. It came up to my knees, then got deeper still. The current was swift as I swam across. On the sandbar, dozens of sand dollars and starfish had been stranded by low tide. They lay dead and bleaching in the sun. I skipped them like river rocks across the surface. The sun beat down on my head. I dove underwater. Sunlight filtered prisms of yellow and green columns. Pieces of seaweed floated into view. As the specks came closer, they began to take shape. Seahorses, just like the one Dad and I had found last year washed up on the beach. He had spotted it first, partially sticking out of a pile of seaweed, dead and dried, a brown ridged spine in the shape of an S. That day we had counted ourselves lucky. We had tied a red ribbon around its neck and hung it on the door of our shack. But the ones floating in the water before me now were alive. Another one floated into view, and then another, each one no bigger than my thumb. Then there were dozens of them floating all around me, an entire school. If Dad had been there, he would have said it was pure luck, that I was a lucky girl. They drifted into the current toward the end of the sandbar where the water turned cold. I followed them out there, but they stayed just beyond my reach. The current was strong, and the water was colder than a spring. I shivered. I gasped for air, and water splashed into my mouth. The sandbar and the beach were out of sight, but I could see tall pines in the distance, green against a pale sky. I caught a breath and dove toward land, but I got nowhere. I surfaced and tried to dog paddle. The sun was high overhead, but it did not warm me. My legs were chilled, the muscles stiffening. I fought to keep my eyes open. I couldn't stop shaking. My brain went dark. The tide pushed me farther out. Dad always said not to fight the current, to let it take you. It took me toward the mouth of the bay. I drifted, shivering and tilting in and out of this world. The pines were gone from view. A dark shape appeared below me, and then another. They came close, disappeared, reappeared, rising and sinking in turns. The water darkened as the shapes congregated and offered an indifferent welcoming. At the entrance to the bay, the bridge stretched over the water, linking the peninsula back to the mainland. The water out there, deep as night. I had already forgotten my last breath. The current took me beneath the bridge, but I could see from high above the water. The shore there was thick with wiregrass, swampland, green and blue swirls below me as I lifted into the air. The world was no longer a tangible thing. Its smells and textures no longer mine. All of it a memory, no more real than the day my father and I found that dried up seahorse on the beach. No more real than his hand slipping from my own. Dad claimed there were no ghosts, only empty rooms full of rusted chains and broken doors. But he was wrong. In these deep waters, the dead are everywhere. All right, cheerful. I have one last story. It's very short. It's flash fiction. It's titled The Train Runner. The girl with the straw-colored hair stands on the tracks, sunlight glaring, bouncing off the metal rails, sparking against the flint and the fill rock. She rubs the top of her head to soothe the heat building there, wishes she owned a ball cap to protect her burning scalp. The 4 o'clock train is due. Push her for words and she'll say the thundering train thrills her to the bone, or that she has no fear. She's dressed in her father's threadbare work shirt, the only remnant of him after he left for the war, and hand-me-down shorts frayed at the cuffs, but with deep pockets where she can keep a coin. Her dog, still plump with puppy fat, has taken to following her around through the afternoon hours after school lets out. He sits on the track, scratching at his ear. Reaching down to tighten a shoelace, she wonders if the train will be on time, though it always is. Shielding her eyes with a salute of sorts, she looks up the track, trying to see beyond the bend. It's obscured by a stand of reforested pine. With her right foot resting lightly on the steel rail, she feels for a vibration. For a moment, she imagines herself an army scout listening for enemy invasion. Sensing the softest rumbling, she sighs with satisfaction, for her skill is sharpening every day. She pulls the coin from her pocket, spits on it, and places it on the center of the rail. A plume of white smoke lifts over the tree line. At the first sight of the black iron grill coming around the bend, the girl and the dog run into the shallow ravine and crouch. Maybe this time the coin will withstand the shuddering quake of the engine and be flattened to perfection. The train lunges closer. The conductor leans out the window, sees the girl, and tugs hard on the whistle pole. A screeching wind booms down the gully. But smashed coins are useless. The candy aisle at the commissary, its bins of bubblegum, caramels, and chocolates will be lost to her. She leaps out of the broad ditch and runs toward the track to grab the coin that would open the door to a sugary afternoon. It's a trick she's done before. The dog stands, the fur along its spine stiffens. He wants to follow her, but the train is bearing down now, billowing steam and a deafening roar. She reaches the coin, snags it with her fingertips, and rolls it into the palm of her hand, then darts across the track to the opposite ravine. The wind blast from the speeding train whips the shirt against her skin and pins her to the ground. Her heart pounds in her chest, her lungs heave and contract. Blood pulses in her temples, floods her brain, rushes through her limbs. She feels it in every muscle, even in her marrow, this youthful, fatal notion that she will live forever. So that's my reading for the evening. Thanks for listening. And Colleen, I think we're ready to get back to maybe some questions now.
Great. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. It's always such a treat to hear an author read her work in her own words since, usually we're alone with the page. So it's really wonderful to hear your voice reading your work. All right, let's dive into some of these questions. Let's see. We'll start off with this one. So someone in the audience has asked, where do you get your ideas for stories? Are they based on real events?
The ideas are normally not based on real events, but some small pieces that I put into the story are things that I remember from last week or decades ago. Pieces of conversation that I just find intriguing can work their way into stories. But the stories usually begin with a character. And I sort of flesh out the character and see what kind of trouble they're in, because most people are in trouble at some point in their life. So I like to look into those dark corners and flesh out a character in regard to the trouble they might be in.
That makes a lot of sense. All right. This is a great question because you showed us such range tonight. You read from a novel, a short story, flash fiction. We also know that you write nonfiction. So is the process of writing a short story different than writing a novel? Or maybe put another way, what is it like switching between forms, and how do you know which story belongs with what kind of form?
That's a good question. Short stories to me feel more like a fun time. It's fun to write them, I think, because I don't feel the pressure of having to come up with 80,000 words, which can take years to do. Short stories, they're like a small problem, whereas a novel is a very big problem. And with lots of little problems coming in sideways, because you have to have you know such a lot of material to go the length of a novel. So when I'm feeling, novels are just they're just a little intimidating to start, because you have such a long way to go.
Mm-hmm.
um, and short stories are just kind of happier little pieces of work that you can spend maybe 2 weeks to 2 months on. So they just feel lighter, even though the material can be super dark.
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, novels can be dark too, but it's just a little bit more fun, I think, to work in the short story form for me.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good question.
All right. Um, we have a question about your story collection here. So when you were writing Rising and Other Stories, did you start writing about a central theme, or did you start writing the stories and the theme emerged to you? This is always a fascinating question, I think, with story collections.
That's a great question. I I did not realize the theme until until we were in the editing process, and my editor at Bronzeville pointed it out to me, and it was kind of weird that I had not noticed that there was such a water theme and so much grief and loss in the short stories. Those This collection was written over about 10 years. So I guess there's a definite theme in my work, for the same material or the same thing to be coming up that many years in a row. And I'm a Floridian, so water is a huge part of my life. I love Florida. I love our rivers and our beaches. And I'm always in water if there's an opportunity. I'm like a lap dog. I just want to jump in everything I see, as long as I can, be pretty sure there aren't any alligators around. You know, you always have to look here. You even have to look in the swimming pool just to make sure one hasn't migrated.
Absolutely. So maybe a good follow-up question to that then is, so if your editor is the one who pointed out that those sort of large themes, how did you pick which stories ended up in the collection? Because 10 years is a long period of time to be writing, and so I have to imagine you wrote lots of things that didn't make it into the collection. So how did you pick and choose which stories ended up in the book?
I picked the ones that felt closest to my heart, the ones that had emotional resonance for me. And there aren't a lot of other short stories that I have that I can that I um, that I chose not to put in the book. There's only a few of those. So while I was writing these short stories in the collection, I also wrote 2 novels. So in that 10-year period of time. So there's not a lot of leftover right now.
Yeah, that's 2 novels in a story collection is a lot of writing.
Turns out it
I'll-
is.
yeah. So are your favorite genres to read your favorite genres to write?
That's a good question. I read pretty broadly. I read a lot of crime fiction, but I also read a lot of literary fiction and short stories. Um, I don't really, I can't even say that I have a favorite genre to read. I like to read widely. Um, but it turns out that what I write has a lot to do with crime. So I'm a little more influenced by that than I actually knew.
Mhm.
Yeah.
All right. This might be a good question to end on. So we have a couple questions about what's your next novel about, or what's your next project? So what are you working on right now and getting ready to put out into the world?
So I just completed a novel, and I'm
Hmm.
waiting to see how that emerges into the world, where it lands and what happens with it. And a lot of the work I'm doing right now is supporting Rising getting into the world. So I've been writing lots of essays and blog, guest blogging. And I just was invited to write a short story for an anthology that Bronzeville Books is doing, I think, next year. So I'm going to be venturing into some weird areas for me. I've never written science fiction or I have written fantasy. So I'm going to be writing a short story for that anthology, and and doing quite a few public appearances and readings. That's what I'm working on right now. It's like balancing the introspection of that you need to write, and also just the public appearances that you need to support the book when it is launched.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to be really excited to be reading more of the work that you uh, put out into the world, and I'm sure everyone in attendance is excited for it as well. So we'll wrap things up then. Uh, to learn more about our summer reading program, please visit the summer reading landing page for information about joining the program, future events, the writing contest, prizes, and more. So you can find that on our library website. So thank you, Gale, so much for joining us tonight. It was such a pleasure to hear you read and to hear you talk about your writing and your process. And thank you, everyone, for attending. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.